Okay, just a quick one today. I've been thinking recently about the principle of charity, and I assume if you've ever been taught philosophy formally, you'll probably have encountered this principle. Any text is open to many different interpretations. Whenever you engage with a philosophical text, you should attribute the strongest possible argument to the author, right? So when we apply the principle of charity, we interpret the text in the most charitable way, attribute to the author the best possible position. So it's essentially steel manning, right? In the case of a straw man argument, you take the most implausible and less defensible interpretation of the opponent's position. When you steel man, you take the best. So that's the general idea of the principle of charity. Actually, that I should say there are more technical versions of the principle of charity, which have like specific roles in philosophy of mind, philosophy of language, epistemology. I mean, Donald Davidson is a big name there. He made a technical form of the principle of charity central to his philosophy. I'm not talking about that. I'm just talking about the kind of metaphilosophical principle about how we should engage with texts and arguments. I mean, I guess, I've never really thought about this in much detail, but there are different versions of this, right? So when we think about what it is to attribute the strongest possible argument to an opponent, there are different ways you might go about that. So you might try to maximize the truth of the premises, try to interpret the text in such a way that most of what they say comes out true. You might try to maximize the rationality of the position, which is a slightly different thing, because it might be that given somebody's epistemic situation, it would be rational for them to believe various falsehoods, or at least not to believe various truths. I mean, certainly if we're interpreting past philosophers, it wouldn't. I mean, obviously, people living in the past are going to have very different beliefs, and quite reasonably so, given the evidence that was available to them. But so it looks like there are going to be different ways of taking what it means to attribute to somebody the strongest argument. I suppose most people probably have in mind that you want to maximize rationality, right? You want to take this person to be reasoning in the best way possible given their situation. Now, when being taught philosophy, I think this is definitely an important rule of thumb. So as a pedagogical tool, it's very useful. The way that it was sometimes presented to me was, if you think that the philosophers you're reading have made an obvious error, right? If you think you can see an obvious contradiction or an obvious logical fallacy, or just or you think there's just obvious counterexamples, or maybe the position is just ridiculous, right? Maybe you read a text and you think this is just insane. This is a ridiculous position. So if you think that there's some obvious problem, it's probably you that's made the error. It's probably you that's misinterpreted them, because these people are, major figures in philosophy who have been taken seriously by a whole bunch of very sophisticated, very well-educated people, and you're just a student, right? So if you attribute an obvious fallacy or something to some famous philosophical text, it's most likely that you've misinterpreted the argument. And as I say, I mean, I can see the point as a pedagogical tool that can be quite useful. But among professionals, once you've already learned philosophy, I guess there's a different question there, right? It's one thing to say that the principle is useful when teaching students how to engage with philosophical texts. It's another to say that this is a principle that constrains just philosophical work in general, including the work of professional philosophers, right? Do professional philosophers use this principle, and should we use this principle? So I mean, the why be charitable, right? Like, what's the point of this? What are we trying to achieve? I've encountered two ways of defending this. One is that charity is somehow a moral requirement. So it's, well, I guess one way to put it would maybe be as a matter of fairness, right? You want others, when they interpret you, to be as charitable as possible, right? To look for the best versions of your arguments. So if that, given that that's what you want other people to treat you that way, that's how you should treat other people. You know, you want others to be charitable to you, so be charitable to others. I get, there's one way to frame it. The most popular way to defend it, though, at least from what I've seen, is something along these lines. Our goal is to find the truth, and our goal is to, as philosophers, our goal is to find the truth and to have well-defended positions, to have good arguments. Now, if I interpret a text as just giving bad arguments, right, then it's going to be easy for me to refute it. I'm not going to face any significant challenge to my own position. If I'm charitable and I steel man the text, then I'm going to face a genuine challenge, and that's going to force me to consider my own position more seriously. It will help me come to have a better understanding of the issues and a better understanding of the relevant arguments. So, I mean, yeah, it's kind of the point that Mill made in On Liberty in the Defence of Freedom of Speech, right? Like you come to a better understanding of your own position by putting it in conflict with alternative, well-defended positions. By interpreting the arguments of other people in the strongest possible way, I'm going to put my own views against the most severe tests. Which, you know, I mean, that will do two things, right? If I'm wrong, that gives me the best chance of changing my mind and becoming right. Okay, so if my position that I currently hold is incorrect, then by engaging with the best possible arguments for other positions, I put myself in the best position to alter my views in the right kind of way. On the other hand, if my views are already correct, well, by engaging with the best possible versions of alternative positions, I will become better able to defend my views, because I have to think, okay, how am I going to respond to people who have good arguments against me? And so I think yeah. When we so those are the main reasons. Oh, actually no. There's another reason as well, which is just I guess as I've already said, you know, these philosophers, if we're talking about professional philosophers or famous figures in philosophy in the past, these are people who we assume were very intelligent, and furthermore, we also know that a whole bunch of other very intelligent people have taken them seriously. So the likelihood is they're not going to have made obvious blunders. At least if they have made obvious blunders, there are going to be relatively few of them. So again, you know, charity is going to lead you to the truth in terms of getting the correct interpretation of the philosopher in question. Well, I was recording this in my room, but my brother informed me he's trying to sleep, so I've come downstairs. Anyway, I was talking about the principle of charity. Now, so that's the principle of charity, and I've been thinking recently about the limits to this principle. Does this make sense to use as just a general principle of interpreting philosophical texts? So, one question here is the principle of charity useful in terms of leading us to the correct interpretation of the philosophers that we are reading? Now, I tend to think that if you're dealing with philosophers who are within your own tradition, or at least, you know, who are contemporary with you and working in the same tradition, then it probably does. It's a bit more problematic if you're attributing, if you're dealing with philosophers in completely different traditions, or especially philosophers from the past. So the basic issue is this. there are lots of philosophers who really have held completely absurd views. Now, what you tend to do when you apply the principle of charity is, you look for the most plausible interpretations. You look for interpretations of the views that are plausible by your lights, reasonable by your lights. The tendency is to say, okay, this philosopher has apparently said X, right? But we can see that what they really meant, if we're going to be charitable, is something kind of like X, but not as completely ridiculous. So I think there's a tendency in the principle of charity to discourage face value interpretations. And in that respect, it may be leading us astray. It may be that, well, actually people just generally say what they mean. I suppose not always, right? I mean, there are going to be some philosophers who favour more metaphorical or poetic expression. But yeah, so here's the thing to bear in mind. Number one, a lot of philosophers have held genuinely ridiculous positions. And number two, philosophers can be pretty damn stupid. I mean, this is certainly the case for philosophers of the past, right? And when I say they can be stupid, I mean they can be wrong about a hell of a lot of stuff. Just consider the empirical beliefs held by someone like Aristotle. He held that, I believe, during... I'm wondering now if this is true or if this is just one of these kind of myths that's kind of arisen. But I'm pretty sure Aristotle held that when a woman has a period, her womb detaches itself and moves around her body. People in the past especially have held beliefs that are just completely crazy. And that may well colour their philosophical work as well. I mean, and what's more, they genuinely were just a lot worse than us at reasoning. Well, okay, maybe I shouldn't have stated that in quite so strong a way. That phrase was stated very strongly. That was probably too strong. I implore you, even though I'm currently criticising the principle of charity, to interpret this video charitably. You should interpret me charitably, even if you shouldn't interpret other people charitably. But, okay, let's put this in slightly more diplomatic terms. We know a lot more about the world, and we stand on the shoulders of giants, right? And one of the things that those giants of the past have done is that they've figured out fallacies and flaws in reasoning, and they've figured out how to distinguish good and bad arguments. But of course, if you were living in the past, like the further back in the past you go, the less there is to draw on. Or, maybe you have as much to draw on, but there hasn't been such a kind of severe selective process applied to it. So it seems there's some reason to think that we might genuinely just be more sophisticated and better at reasoning. And so if we think we identify some obvious problem in the work of the past philosopher, maybe it really is just an obvious problem, right? Maybe we've just correctly identified, yeah, that's just a clear problem, and charity would lead us to misinterpret them. I mean, another point here is that, and I mean, this is especially the case for philosophers working in other traditions, is that there are many philosophers who might not even be attempting to hold a coherent view. They might see themselves as engaging in a different kind of activity. Maybe instead of trying to come up with a logically consistent system, like systematized view of the world, maybe they're doing something more playful, more critical. And I'm thinking in particular of somebody like Paul Feyerabend, right? So Feyerabend drifted a little bit from the analytic tradition. I mean, he started off within analytic philosophy of science, but then in later years he drifted away from that. And it's not at all obvious that Feyerabend was even trying, to be coherent. If we kind of try to force Feyerabend's work into a sensible and coherent framework, if we try to interpret him as offering sensible and coherent views, might we simply be missing the point? I mean, he was trying to be a bit of a troll, a bit of a gadfly. He was trying to shake things up. And shaking things up, sometimes by forwarding ideas that are ridiculous and inconsistent and so on, might be the best way of doing that. I believe also this is something, and I mean, I'm not an expert on this, but I believe this is also something that occurs in Zen philosophy, where you will say things that maybe are inconsistent or not coherent, or maybe not even properly conceivable. You'll say things that maybe seem to be meaningless in order to kind of shock the rational mind. So clearly, it looks like if we're looking at philosophers in different traditions, you've got to bear in mind, attempting to attribute a sensible, plausible, coherent, consistent position to them might just be missing the point of what they're doing. So one problem with charity then is that it may well lead us astray when we are interpreting other philosophers. Now, a second problem is, I guess, more broadly about how we go about finding the truth, right? So I said that one of the arguments for charity is I want to put my own position in conflict with the best possible versions of other positions. It's not obvious that charity is the right way to approach this, though. So okay, one way to think about this is, what counts as a good argument? What counts as a sensible position? Well, our evaluation of that is going to depend on our philosophical background. Now, by interpreting other people as holding positions that we regard as ridiculous, right? Let's imagine another principle, right? A principle that we try to attribute the most ridiculous position to other philosophers. Okay, so by applying this principle and interpreting other philosophers as holding the most ridiculous positions possible, this may force us to engage with perspectives that are completely different from our own, right? So, if we're granting that our own philosophical views are perhaps not as well supported as we assume, if we're being kind of fallibilists about this, we're saying, well, yeah, maybe there are things that we take to be obvious that are wrong. It might be more useful to confront your philosophical views with radically different philosophical views. It does seem quite clear that what counts as a ridiculous position. Well, that's kind of up for grabs. Even the basic patterns of argumentation, basic patterns of inference have been questioned. So think of, for instance, dialetheism, right? The view that there are true contradictions. If you're a philosopher working in the analytic tradition before dialetheism emerged, right? Like, everybody just assumes that contradiction is unacceptable. Okay, so of course, if you're applying the principle of charity and you look at the history of philosophy, you're really going to go out of your way to interpret past philosophers or philosophers from other traditions in a way that is logically consistent by the standards of whatever logical system you accept. But then along come these dialetheists, and it's like, okay, people actually genuinely just hold that there are true contradictions, and they have some pretty sophisticated arguments for this. And so suddenly there's, maybe work in Buddhist philosophy or Indian philosophy, or these alternative philosophical traditions, where they seem to be saying there are true contradictions as well, and it looks like maybe that's just how we should take them, right? That's the position we should attribute to them. This is especially problematic. This whole point is especially problematic given that, as I mentioned, part of the point of the principle of charity is to attribute the strongest possible position to your opponents. But of course, what makes a position strong, right? Well, we're going to use certain values to judge that. We're going to say maybe theoretical simplicity, coherence, empirical adequacy, fruitfulness for developing other views, etc. These values may have been much less important to others, and so it may be that attributing a position that by our lights is ridiculous is the right way to go, and it will reveal a completely new and completely different way of looking at things. We'll reveal perhaps the way in which our own views are dependent on values that maybe had not really been questioned. In kind of the way that consistency, right, as this overriding value, perhaps hadn't been questioned until somebody like Graham Priest comes along and writes whole books about why no contradictions can be tolerated. So we are weird, right? We are Western educated, industrial, rich and democratic. And that may well colour our perspective on philosophical issues. I think there's a general concern then that charity is going to lead to a kind of domestication. So, and that will mean that, number one, we might well interpret past philosophers incorrectly, and number two, we're going to fail to engage with radical alternatives. And there might be something quite useful about engaging with radically different alternatives, with people who challenge the most foundational values and foundational assumptions in ways that maybe initially seem to us to be ridiculous. Third point about charity, where charity maybe has limits, is it seems like there are going to be cases where this might just be dangerous in some way. If we are engaging in a conversation with, bad faith actors, right? People who... So, look, there are some positions that are dangerous, right? Like, let's say Nazism, okay? Do you want to interpret a Nazi charitably? It's not obvious what would be gained by doing this, right? There are two models of debate. There's debate as fighting, or debate as like boxing, right, where you have two or more people going up against each other and attacking each other, and one of them wins and one of them loses. And then there's debate as exploration of possibilities. I've always, whenever I engage in any kind of debate, I prefer to think of it as an exploration of possibilities. It's like, let's work together. I'll present my view, you present your view. I present the reasons for my position, you present the reasons for yours. We see if we can work through the arguments, and we see what ideas we can come up with. It's a matter of exploring conceptual space. And that's not how a lot of people tend to approach it, right? A lot of people tend to approach debates as fights, right? The goal is to beat the opponent, which is fine in many cases, but sometimes there are views that are just genuinely dangerous, like Nazism, right? Generally, Nazis are probably much more interested in just beating the opponents. They just want Nazism to win, right? And so if you're faced with somebody who's coming to the debate as a fight, and they're fighting for a genuinely terrible position, right? What is to be gained by being charitable to them? Especially if they, let's say, are using argumentative techniques like gish galloping, right? Do you want to be charitable to somebody who's doing that? Somebody who's just throwing out a whole bunch of reasons, none of which are maybe very well thought out, right? But they're just trying to overwhelm the opposition by throwing out like loads and loads of arguments that, if you were to analyse them individually, would be seen to be silly. But when you just pump loads of them out, it makes the position appear strong. Well, if you try to be charitable in that case, if you're trying to be charitable to a Nazi who is gish galloping you, then all you're going to be doing is you're going to be constructing good arguments, or attempting to construct good arguments for Nazism. Now obviously the lines here are difficult to draw, right? And actually this is one of the problems. So Nazism is awful, and maybe we can all agree that Nazism is awful, but there are more moderate positions which maybe have some sort of initial plausibility. Maybe somebody is expressing nationalism and race realism, right? And they're not actually coming out and saying let's exterminate the Jews, but they are holding positions that are, let's say, in the general vicinity of Nazism. The problem is that a lot of people with these kind of ideologies don't just come out and say it, right? They will intentionally hold back, and they'll intentionally present a kinder face to the public. I remember watching an interview with a extremist, fundamentalist Islamic preacher. I can't remember which one it was, but I would say about 95% of what he said in that interview was perfectly reasonable stuff. And it was stuff that, a lot of people would agree with. He was complaining about, the interference of the British government in Islamic countries, right? Like, that was what he kind of insisted on focusing on. And so you have somebody who actually is part of a movement that is genuinely horrifying and, scary, but the public face that they're presenting is, much more socially acceptable. Again, this is a case where it looks like charity might be the wrong way to go about this. It might be a mistake to be charitable to people like that. So yeah, anyway, those were just some thoughts on charity. I suppose, there is a broader question here of, okay, what does any of this matter? I don't know, how long has this been recording now? Yeah, I've been going on for a lot longer than 10 minutes. Maybe I'll try to edit this down before I put it up, because I don't think that it really does matter that much. So the way that I tend to think about this actually is, look, whenever we face a particular text, right, we can be charitable, we can be anti-charitable, we can apply the principle of charity, or we can apply the principle of ridiculousness, or some other principle, depending on what our purposes are. We can have more than one interpretation of a text in mind. So, if we see some text and we see that it's open to interpretations A, B, C, D, E, F, G, why not just say that? Why not say, okay, here are some interpretations, and then you leave it at that? I mean, again, if you are learning philosophy, if you're a philosophy student, you can't just leave it at that. You can't just be like, okay, here are a bunch of interpretations. No, if you're a student, essays are going to be very short. You can't spend thousands of pages arguing or talking about a position. So, you've got to pick one interpretation and argue for it. I guess it makes sense to pick the one that's like the strongest argument, because part of what you're doing as a student is honing your own skills at constructing good arguments and responding to arguments effectively. But for the rest of us, what interpretation we choose surely is going to be dependent on our purposes. And actually, even if you're a student, you should probably bear in mind that texts you're reading are open to different interpretations, and you should look for those different interpretations. I tend to think of any text that I'm reading kind of like how I approach a work of art, insofar as I don't think it's really up to the author what the meaning is, right? I tend to think the idea that there's some sort of, real meaning behind the surface text is a little bit silly. Even if the question is, okay, what did the author intend by this? Part of the reason for that is that I'm not sure that there is necessarily a determinate fact about what an author intended. I'm just thinking about things that I've written here. It seems that sometimes an argument emerges in the interaction with others. So I will write something, and then somebody else will read it, and they'll see something in it that I didn't clearly see when I was writing it, but I can immediately see, okay, that makes a lot more sense. And this kind of process can go on indefinitely, right? So if I might like write a first draft, somebody reads it, I see, okay, that's an interpretation that makes more sense. So maybe I alter the draft, but then once I've finished it and it's done, it can still be read and reinterpreted and so on. That that process of interpretation, I see it as a kind of collaborative. It's a collaborative process, and so I'm not sure the idea of there being some fixed determinate meaning necessarily makes sense, especially because what we tend to do in philosophy is we tend to draw distinctions that others may not have seen. Right, that's a big part of philosophy, is honing our concepts, making our concepts more precise, drawing distinctions that hadn't been noticed before. So if I'm reading David Hume, right, I may have much more precise concepts in mind relating to the sort of things he was talking about. So by my lights, he may not have, there may not be a determinate meaning that he had in mind, right? Because by my lights, I can see distinctions that were invisible to him. And of course, even if there is such a thing as the real meaning, the real thing that the author intends, we generally have no way of accessing that other than by asking them, right? In the case of past philosophers, you can't ask them. In the case of philosophers who are still living, you can ask them, but why should you assume that they're going to give you the right answer? I mean, memory is fallible, and as I've just said, in my own experience, I've written stuff, and I think that it does tend to happen that I maybe don't. It sounds stupid. I don't know exactly what my own argument is until I start engaging with others. So, yeah, I guess the point of all of this is that really it's fine to just have a lot of different interpretations, and whether you attribute the most charitable interpretation to the author is going to depend on what your purposes are. Certainly for the purposes of learning philosophy, that makes a lot of sense. But, we might have other goals in mind. All right, I've been talking about this, I think, for way too long, so I'm going to stop now.